Attune your Vox grills and adjust your data tellers. Today we're doing a data sermon on the current state of the Adeptus Mechanicus in 9th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video I thought we'd take a return to the Adeptus Mechanicus and do a full army overview in 9th edition, talk about their current state of the game, perhaps some of their strongest rules and tricks that they can bring to bear from the Codex, talk through their units, their supplemental content and potential knight allies, and finish up with one idea for a competitive army list. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump in. So 9th edition has been a bit of a rollercoaster ride for the Adeptus Mechanicus. They started out at least fairly strong with their core rules left over from 8th edition and their powerful engine war supplements, and then getting one of the earlier codexes they turned out to be ridiculously strong on first drop. In particular, undercosted core Iron Striders and Skitarii infantry ruled the roost, and the Admech were capable of hoovering most other armies off the table, maybe with the exception of Skitarii. Following that though, the codex received some successive nerfs. First up, they nerfed some of their best stratagems and lost core on the Iron Striders. A fair few people reacted by shifting to mass spam of Taraxes, Sicarians and Cerberus, and then Games Workshop swung the balance hammer very hard and basically gave them points increases on just about all their most competitive units. In particular, with the recent strong codexes that have been coming out, they're now one of the weaker armies in the game, though I'd still argue that with the depth and options in the codex they can still do well in good hands, though it's likely to be an uphill struggle against the things that are dominating the meta the most. As a faction, they've still got a fair amount of cool options to draw you to them, decent shooting between big blocks of rangers, or maybe Iron Striders with Cognis las cannons, and supported Rust Stalkers can do very well in melee, being a pretty fast and scary melee threat that deletes most things. They've got good supplemental options, the Skitarii Veteran cohort and the Metallica supplements, and the main challenge with them at the moment is to make use of their best stacking buffs and army-wide rules and character support all to come together on units to create some terrors on the table. With things like Lucius, Light Cover and Bulwark Doctrine, you could make Skitarii infantry really obnoxious to shift off the table, and you also have options for making things move a lot faster or upping their firepower significantly. For main weaknesses, just generally quite a lot of the datasheets aren't anywhere near as efficient as they used to be. Almost all the really good stuff went up in points a fair bit, and most of the datasheets are in the area of being kind of usable, but not particularly standout. The complexity of the codex is a bit of a disadvantage in itself. You often need multiple stacking buffs to really make the rules work well. If certain elements get picked apart at the wrong time, it can really go wrong. And despite having powerful army-wide rules, sometimes it can be a hindrance as much of a help. For example, Doctrina Imperatives really buffing a couple of units in your army, but massively ruining the chances of something on the other side of the battlefield. They also do have some of their own weaknesses within the codex. There's a few options that they just don't really do. Massive combat characters, for example. They don't have a ton of psychic defense, and outside of buffed up Skitarii blocks, they might well struggle for anvil units to hold the center table, particularly ones that are proficient in melee. In general though, they've certainly shown that they can work as a competitive army. I'd argue that they're perhaps just a little bit overpointed at the moment, and given 9th edition's constant power creep, I do feel that Games Workshop could get away with reducing their nerfs, and maybe reverting a few more points costs at least closer back to where they were originally. Let's go through a few of the rules sections and some of the standout points. For the core army rules, we're split with Doctrina Imperatives on the Skitarii and the Canticles of the Omnissiah on the Cult Mechanicus units, and most of the infantry units get bionics as well. The Doctrina Imperatives are really quite cool and can give you a big leg up in certain phases. Protector giving you +1 to hit at range, Conqueror the same in melee, Bulwark extra saves, and Aggressor extra speed, though all of them equally debuff their counterparts, so if you get better at range then you get worse in melee, for example. These really are quite nice, and if your setup army can take advantage of the buffs without being hurt by the debuffs too much, then they really can make the army feel like they're playing on an extra level. Protector might not be the worst one to do early in the game when few units are in combat. Conqueror could well support a big heavy Rust Stalker charge provided you don't have too much shooting going on. Bulwark is a massive defensive bonus, but is going to mess around with troops that are wanting to get where they need to be. An Aggressor could potentially be a good one very early game or late game. Perhaps early game if the vast majority of your army is hidden turn 1, or late game when you absolutely need the extra movement to push to objectives and your opponent might not have all that much to kill you with. They certainly make you want to take a Skitarii Marshal along to give you some protection against the negatives on the most important units, and these are much better in the veteran cohort I think, due to that nice Cantic Thrownet relic, which allows you to act with these a bit more flexibly. For the Court Mechanicus units, or if you're playing Mars to get them on your main Skitarii, then you also have Canticles of the Omnissiah. I'd say pretty much all of these are decently useful. Shroud's Arm could potentially stack durability with Bulwark if you're playing Mars. A +2 to saves is very nice, particularly on vehicles. Benediction of the Omnissiah really amps up things like Cognis weapons with rerolls. Machine Vengeance could be good for things like Taraxi or Electro Priests coming in from reserve potentially. And if you do have a turn where it looks like you're going to be getting a lot of units in combat or getting charged quite a bit, then you can crack out +1 strength or -1 to hit. Even the one that offers protection against mortal wounds, which I thought was a bit rubbish when it first came out, is now quite a lot more relevant in 40k, as so many armies like to spam psychic and mortal wounds at you. Particularly in Mars, choosing turn on turn for these two really can alter the way that the game progresses, and if you manage to hit the right things at the right times, then it will give you meaningful advantages. Finally, for army rules that apply to most things, we've got Bionics. They help out with infantry versus high AP, usually with a 5+ or 6+ invul. Always good to know that you're usually guaranteed some sort of save, and it can allow things to unexpectedly survive once in a while. Next up, if we talk Forge Worlds, I think the Games Workshop has actually done a fairly good job of making most of them usable, though I do feel a few stick out maybe above the rest. I think Mars has always been one of the most tempting choices, just because you get the single reroll, which usually helps your firepower quite consistently throughout the game. And then Canticles of the Omnissiah on Skitarii really allow you to make best use of both of the tables of turn-by-turn buffs, particularly just the power of getting a massive shooting buff with, say, both Benediction and Protector in one turn, and then one turn of enormous durability with Bulwark and Shroud's Arm. Otherwise, spitting out a bunch of mortal wounds with Wrath of Mars never hurts, can be quite good on Taraxi Sterilizers or big ranger blocks, and I actually think that the Red Axe is kind of okay as a combat relic. It's one of the best ways to actually make a Tech Priest kind of fighting. Otherwise, another mainstay has been Lucius. Their Solar Blessing helps keep infantry safe, giving them better saves against damage 1 weapons, usually the weapons that are going to be turned against them in the case of Rangers and Vanguard. Combine that with Luminescent Blessing to give a squad transhuman physiology, and you get a very tanky Ranger or Vanguard blob on your hands. They have a small boost to the range of weapons, the Solar Flare can teleport an important squad around the board, and you can also deep strike a unit or two as well, which doesn't hurt against the right army. Finally, for my favourite 3 is Metallica. They get to move around guilt-free as they don't suffer the penalty for, say, Rangers or Vanguard moving or advancing with their weapons, and just beyond that they've got a whole supplement of extra options to play with, a bunch more stratagems, relics and warlord traits. Perhaps out of the stratagems, some of the most interesting ones are one to turn off rerolls, or one where you can mess with the enemy movement characteristic, and you can stack a couple of really quite potent debuffs on a Tech Priest Warlord, which can potentially have the vast majority of your weapons wounding a unit really easily if you can get alongside them. Otherwise, I think that you can make a case for literally any of the others, to be honest. Riser gives you the +1 to wound on the charge, very nice with Rust Stalkers or Sindonian Dragoons. There's a couple of nice ones from the custom Forge World options. Data Horde gives you a 6+ feel no pain on vehicles and rerolls for Cognis weapons, which is great on Iron Strider spam. And the Rad Saturated World could make spamming Vanguards genuinely interesting. Strength 4 and AP -1 on those Radium Carbines is very nice. Otherwise, Digi's 8 gives you some fun shenanigans with infiltration tricks to start your units close to the enemy, and a bit of survivability at long range doesn't hurt either. Agrippinar gives you extra AP within half range, which could be worse when there's a fair few high saves going around with Armour of Contempt, I guess. And Graia was usually the one that I'd always dismiss, though even they might be a little bit better than they used to be. They do get the 5+ save against mortal wounds, and quite a lot of armies do use that as a big damage mechanic. It still probably wouldn't be the one that I'd pick first though. Otherwise, let's just have a quick sort through some of the other sections of the codex. Here are just a few of the generic stratagems that I find a bit more interesting, things that are a little bit less unit locked. +1 strength can be pretty handy to have pop up on just about any Skitarii. If it makes the difference between wounding on a 4+ or 3+, then it's often going to be worth it. It can actually make big blocks of 20 Rangers or Vanguard actually a semi-serious threat in close combat as well. There's one command point for a 4+ save against mortal wounds on vehicles. You can distribute relics and warlord traits within Skitarii squads for a command point each as well. That's another common pick. You've got 2 CP for an Auspex scan type stratagem, which means that you can deny some area to reserves with big blocks of shooting units. You can have some surprise fights last on the go if you need it with electroshocks. It means that a tech priest can always give the opponent the chance to fight last and can actually be a surprisingly useful thing to have in combat. For 1 CP you've got the option to auto-pass morale on an objective. It makes the auto-passing stratagem a lot less painful if you've just say got a couple of rangers or vanguard clinging to life and you absolutely want to guarantee that they stick around to hold that objective. This was FAQ'd to be 1 use only, and I'm always quite a fan of the auto-explodes vehicle stratagems. Something like a sacrificial Dune Rider could perhaps do a fair amount of explosion damage if it did happen to go down in the heart of a whole bunch of enemy units. The Tech Priests can be upgraded to Holy Orders, and generally if you do have good units to buff, then it's usually worth taking at least one of them. Perhaps the most commonly picked tends to be Logi for ignoring AP-1 and AP-2 attacks. It's a very common combination on Skitarii 1 wound infantry, as usually most damage 1 weapons will be AP-2 or worse. Making all those countered AP-0 can be well worth the 40 points. Otherwise, Artisans can give you another option for falling back in shooting. Again, very nice on the big blobs, and I think both Magi and Genitors are usable too. The Magi buffs could give you a little bit further advances, increasing threat ranges on things like advancing and charging Rust Stalkers, and if you did activate to the advanced part, then the shooting buff is pretty decent as well. All of them give you a small refund on a stratagem once per game, and usually between the free command point and the buff, they'll typically be worth the price. Moving on, and for the Warlord traits, the Admech have 12, 6 for the Skitarii and 6 for the Tech Priests. On the whole though, I would rate the Skitarii ones as decently better most of the time. They're pretty powerful and usable buffs to apply to your core Skitarii units. They can be doled out within 9 inches or potentially broadcast over the entire battlefield if the target unit happens to have a data tether. If you want more of them, you can also buy them in squads with the command point that we mentioned. For the Skitarii ones, there's loads of usable ones. Maybe some of the 2 best are falling back and shooting, really handy if you are going to have powerful infantry shooting units. And there's one that grants light cover as well, 5-point telemetry cache. It makes them even harder to shift if they're already in light cover. And between this and Bulwark, you can make a squad ridiculously hard to remove. Otherwise, there's one for ignoring shooting penalties, and one for doing an action and shooting, both of which can be good. Out of the Tech Priest ones, I'd say most of them seem okay, but don't really see that much play in my experience. Perhaps one of my favourites might actually be the durability boost of the Masterwork Bionics. A 4+ invul and -1 damage certainly makes one of your priests very hard to remove. I'd say their unique secondary objectives aren't enormously standout, but are usable. Perhaps my favourite might be that Uncharted sequencing one, where you basically line up which objectives you're going to try and take each turn. If you've got a very deliberate battle plan and you can think about how the game's going to unfold, then that one seems like it to be fairly reliable in a high objective count game, at least maybe for a very reliable 9 points, and maybe more if the game's going your way. If you've got at least 1 vehicle in tow as well, then Eradication of Flesh could be good. If you're playing against an enemy unit with a whole bunch of small infantry going on, maybe something like multiple small unit Genestealer Cult maybe, then this one should yield you a fair amount of victory points if there wasn't anything better from Purge the Enemy. Finally, for relics, I think a few of them do stand out. Exemplar's Eternity is very near an auto-include for a buffing Skitarii Marshal. Reroll ones to hit and wound for a cheap character plus a relic is great. Maybe if you're looking to buy in squad relics, you could think about the Tempocopia or the Omniscient Mask for a Rust Stalker squad. The Tempocopia gives you fights last within the same unit. Very handy if you're charging multiple things on different sides of the board, and the Omniscient Mask can just give you a little bit more of a damage boost with exploding 6s. Otherwise, the Raiment of the Technomartyr is a pretty powerful one. It gives you a 5+ feel no pain to make one character pretty tanky, and also comes with a decent buff of 1 unit within 3 inches ignoring modifiers, so say keeps a big block of rangers accurate even while they're on the move. If you want a weapon, then I quite like the Sonic Reaper as well for a Tech Priest Manipulus. Maybe a bit opportunistic, but the chance to farm out a bunch of mortal wounds if you roll well is very nice indeed. Lastly, before we get into datasheets, the Admech do have a few sections of rules outside the Codex, the Metallica supplement that we already talked about a bit in the Forge World section, and 2 Armies of Renown, the Skitarii Veteran Cohort and Mechanicus Defense Cohort. The Defense Cohort I find a bit underwhelming. It locks you to just Court Mechanicus units, and most of the usable ones tend to be Skitarii in my opinion. I don't really think that the trade-offs you make for this are quite good enough and worthy of the buffs, so I'd probably not play that one myself. On the other hand though, the Skitarii Veteran Cohort is arguably one of the strongest ways to play Admech right now. It does come with a few trade-offs, but also lots of quite powerful buffs for your units. You can't take Court Mechanicus stuff besides Tech Priests, and while that does limit you for a few datasheets, most of the book does tend to be Skitarii, and it does force you to upgrade your Rangers and Vanguard to Veterans for 2 points per model each. They get 5+ invuls, +1 attack, and a stealth benefit for the Rangers, and a movement benefit for the Vanguard. I'd say this trade-off is at least fairly moot as you are paying the extra points for it, but getting a 5+ invul save means that I don't think it usually actually makes them worse. The +1 attack as well can make a big block of them punch surprisingly hard, particularly if your opponent charged them with something like a fragile melee unit. You might well at least have a decent chance of wiping them out in return. Really though, I think the big draws to taking this are the Warlord traits, Relic and Stratagems. The Relic in the Cantic Thrallnet is maybe the best thing. It allows you to put a second Doctriner on one unit. So say for example you could have a unit of Rust Stalkers going in both Aggressor and the +1 to hit in melee one, or you could just sit around handing out one unit +1 to hit at range all game, and keep some very impressive firepower coming. The Stratagems are generally a little bit on the expensive side. There's options for a 5+ Feel No Pain, +1 attacks on an important unit, and +1 to wound for 2 of your core units focusing down one enemy, all of which I think are usable, though a little bit on the costly side. Then though there's also the option for Rust Stalkers to advance and charge, which given their already fast movement gives them a crazy threat range to jump halfway across the board in a single turn, particularly if they get Aggressor Doctrine either from the one that you've picked or from the Cantic Thrallnet. Finally, the Warlord trait allows you to get discounts on these decent stratagems, depending on which Doctriner is active for your army. Again, it could be annoying if they don't quite come together and you don't have the active Doctriner when you really want the stratagem, but it does mean that you could save potentially 4 CP on some decent buffs, and it does seem to be another very commonly played one. In general, people taking the veteran cohorts tend to take a few big blocks of Rangers or Vanguard, and backed up by a decent amount of Taraxi or Sicarians. Speaking of which though, let's talk through the datasheets, and we'll start off with the squads, the infantry and cavalry of the Admech. First up we have the troops, and particularly out of this section the Skitarii Rangers stand out a lot to me. They're perhaps one of the most ideal recipient units for all the buffs that we've talked about so far. They do solid range damage for their 9-point cost, and big blocks can be nice both for receiving buffs to how dangerous they are, and also being durable too, with things like 5-point telemetry and Lucius being good targets for them. On top of that, Galvanic Volley Fire is usually worth the CP. An extra 20 shots out of a buffed up Ranger unit can be really lethal. I'd say that Vanguard are maybe a tiny bit more niche than Rangers, mainly because their stratagem got nerfed harder, and I typically want to use them a bit more for small skirmishy type units, going after objectives and things, and maybe being a bit more sacrificial, though they should still do decently well against enemy equivalents like this, with volume strength 3 fire with some auto wounds, and their rad saturation actually makes them surprisingly okay in combat against other toughness 3 infantry. Out of the Cataphrons, people tend to prefer the Breachers over the Destroyers, and I've seen some people even spam entire armies of Breachers just to get crazy amounts of toughness 5 2+ saves on the board. Their arc rifles are fairly good generalist guns, though I'd argue perhaps not massively outstanding for the cost, though they can punch quite hard in melee with damage 3 hydraulic claws. Not terrible, and you could certainly use a durable unit of them to act as a bit of a melee anvil threat, which the Admech doesn't have a lot of. Not being core for these or the Destroyers though really does hurt them. It means that they have limited access to buffs. The Cataphron Destroyers I don't really rate quite so highly. The firepower's okay, but not enormously impressive, and I think other things tend to outshoot them. For elites, probably the Sicarians are the most interesting ones in my mind. Rust Stalkers have very solid general purpose melee damage and threat range as we've mentioned, and in the veteran cohort have 2 different stratagems to give them +1 attack, so you could be having 5 attacks per guy. Again, as core Skitarii infantry they can get tons of buffs, and they're quite good places for the Tempocopia or Omniscient Mask. They seem to be a unit included in most Admech competitive lists these days. I'd also likely back them up with a unit or 2 of Infiltrators. They've got okay damage profiles in their own right, but also allow you to screen out the midfield and do early actions and objectives and things, as well as potentially posing a first turn charge threat. I'd say the Electro Priests are still good, maybe just a tiny bit behind these two. The Corpuscari are okay general purpose anti-infantry, maybe a little bit tailored to their role, and the Fulgurites are good all-round melee damage, potentially hitting even harder than Rust Stalkers if you're not supporting the Rust Stalkers, and maybe might be best jumping out of a Dune Rider, as they are a bit fragile and they might be easily killed if they're just slogging up towards the enemy. Servitors were kind of good when they could do actions reliably, but with changes to things like retrieve Nachman's data it made them a bit less usable. They're still very cheap though, and could be okay for just absolute grunt work and screening if you don't want them to do any damage. and the Forge World Skitarii ironically suffer from not being able to take an Admech Forge World option and generally lose out to the other players. Finally, in the fast attack, we have the Taraxi. The Sterilizers get my vote over the Skystalkers. The 2-point upgrade really is worth it for an actual decent ranged weapon that can cause some good damage to infantry. Plus they're a bit more of a threat in melee, with their deeply sunk talons causing some movement shenanigans. The stratagem to jump them around the board can be really handy late game as well if you need to do some actions in the opponent's half. The Skystalkers I think just take too much of a downgrade on the guns for that, plus they don't have the deeply sunk talons thing. Cerberus Raiders I still think are pretty solid, maybe 1 or 2 units to pre-game move along with the Infiltrators. Plus if the opponent forgets that they have Tactica Obliqua, their option to run away when charged, then they could have their melee army being a bit flat-footed and unable to engage your outlying units. The Sulphur Hounds have always just seemed a bit pricey to me. I think their damage is okay, but it's generally a bit too anti-infantry tailored and it won't do all that well against hard targets. I just kind of feel for that cost they do need to be a bit more general purpose and threatening to everything. Vehicles next, and despite their points increases and losing core, I still would probably rate Iron Striders as one of the strongest in the codex. 85 points for a couple of damage D3+3 weapons that move very quickly isn't bad, and they're particularly nice in Mars with the rerolls helping out the unit a lot, plus that benevolence of the Omnisire Canticore can make those las cannons super reliable. They've got a handy movement stratagem to allow them to advance and shoot for no penalty to get them right where they need to be. A lot of people seem to like running them in units of 1s or 2s as a bit of a harassment threat that can punch far above its weight. Otherwise, on the stronger end of the section are the Scorpius Dune Rider and Sindonian Dragoons. The Dune Rider is a nice cheap transport, does a little bit of volume fire with its stubbers, and I think is a pretty okay option for Rust Stalkers or Fulgurite Priests, or if you're doing something like delivering a Dominus near to the enemy to put some debuffs on them in Metallica. Sindonian Dragoons are okay in melee as well. They're fairly cheap and fast, maybe their main disadvantage is that they're actually vehicles, which can make them interact poorly with terrain and sometimes struggle to get charges on units. Certainly seem a solid option if you're going Riser. Otherwise, I'd say that most of the other vehicles are usable, though just not very exciting. The Fuselav and the Stratoraptor are both very manoeuvrable, and they do have some good tricks like turning off rerolls, or the Fuselav can status bomb things. They used to be absolutely awesome, but since they went up in cost a fair bit and couldn't be spammed as much, they certainly slid down the pecking order. The Transvector maybe is one of the weaker units in the codex though. It's just very expensive compared with the Dune Rider for how much it can transport. Castellan robots are one of the more interesting Cult Mechanicus units in that they're a really big tanky unit that can get core. Even when buffed up though, I feel they're still a bit underwhelming and rarely seem to make it into any sort of competitive list. And both the Onagers and Scorpius tanks can do some fairly decent direct firepower if that's what you're after on the home field battle line. The Scorpius Dune Riders used to be really common includes with the Belarus energy cannons, but Games Workshop's barrage changes basically nerfed them into near uselessness. A bit of a downside of a sweeping game change that was mainly aimed to fix other things. Finally, for Forge World we have the Terrax Pattern Termite Transport. At 180 points it is a rather expensive transport, though it does deal okay anti-armor damage and is fairly tough. Perhaps could be okay for delivering something like some Corpuscari to the board, whether that's actually using its drill to deep strike or just trundling it up the table. Finally, for the datasheets, we have the characters. If you're using any numbers of Skitarii, I'd be surprised if you didn't take a Skitarii Marshal along. Very cheap, efficient rerolls, and that ignoring the Doctrina downsides is very handy. Plus you can bear those good relics like the Exemplar's Eternity or the Cantic Thrownet, and has access to those good Skitarii Warlord traits which you could broadcast over data tethers. Out of the Tech Priests, I think they've done okay to make most of them have a good role. If you're buffing Skitarii shooting infantry like ranged or vanguard blocks, then probably the Manipulus is the way to go. Extra range and extra AP each turn is a nice little boost, and like all the Tech Priests he has at least a little bit of damage and defense going on as well. He can also be very good for bearing that Logi trait and the raiment of the Technomartyr. Otherwise, the Dominus is an okay generalist. Rerolls wise, I just feel like he loses out to a Marshal with the Exemplar's Eternity, though if you're buffing things like Tech Priest then it's alright. The Engineer is the one to go for if you're going with a more vehicle strategy. If you've got multiple Scorpiuses or Onagers, then he's not a bad shout. The Techno-Archaeologist maybe seems like he's got a little bit of an underwhelming datasheet, though he is a pretty handy force for messing around with objectives. He can allow you to shoot while doing actions, which is quite nice for some secondaries like raising banners, and if you're playing an army with heavy reserves, then parking him on an objective can guarantee that it's safe until he's dead. I'd say maybe Belisarius Call is one of the ones that sees the least play. Despite basically being Commander-in-Chief, he is a little underwhelming for the points cost. Perhaps his main draw is his full hit rerolls on big ranked up infantry squads, and at least he's rather tough and provides a bit more of a melee threat than most of the other priests. Finally, I guess the Datasmith is a character as well. I'd usually want one if I was bringing Castellan robots, though the Castellan bots themselves aren't exactly the biggest hotness right now. As well as units out of the Codex though, you do also have the option for bringing allies. A few people are a bit tempted to bring Knights of the Cog now that the Imperial Knights have got redone. The Knight of the Cog rule is one that allows you to bring a super heavy auxiliary detachment along for 3 CP, and if it's a Mechanicus one, then it doesn't break your Doctrina imperatives, secondary objectives, or canticles of the Omnissiah. For the most part, I'd say it's fairly similar to just bringing a Freeblade Knight with the new Agent of Imperium rules that they've got, and I did talk over that a little bit in a Allying One Knight video. Perhaps one of the single most attractive things could be allying a few Auspex armigers into the mix, having things that move 12 inches, pack some decent range and melee damage, and also secure objectives for you is quite a nice combo. Perhaps the biggest advantage of the Knight of the Cog rule means that you could be spending 3 CP and getting an actual Mechanicus household within a super heavy auxiliary detachment, and they can get the household traits as well, as per a rule in the Imperial Knight Codex. I guess maybe one of the most tempting things for that could be a trio of Armiger Warglaves, maybe in House Tyrannus. That'll net you a 6+ Feel No Pain, the Mechanicus extra wound and healing thing, and House Tyrannus also has that fun stratagem where you have the option of trying to bring a knight back from the dead on a 4+, which can be really disruptive if a knight pops up where your opponent really wanted one killed. Another quite specific option is allying Raven alongside Metallica with the Knight of the Iron Cog stratagem. That costs just 1 command point for a knight unit to give them all canticles of the Omnissiah, which is a rather powerful benefit when you wind up throwing it around on knights. Benediction could give them some very nice shooting rerolls, you could get light cover for a turn for knights with 2+ saves or better, and a few nice combat buffs or debuffs as well. If you wanted to spend loads of CP, you could be taking big Raven Knight detachments, but again it might be more efficient on a super heavy auxiliary with Raven armigers in. They advance and shoot, so it could be quite nice to use on some Helverins or Moiraxes perhaps. I think both of those are pretty interesting, but otherwise besides knights you could consider something like an Inquisitor. I've seen at least a few people ally those into Admech armies as they provide a few things that Admech don't have. You can get a bit of command point farming from a Warlord trait. There's a psychic spell to cancel Overwatch, which could be quite nice with priests or Ruststalkers. Some of the unique ones like Greyfax can do psychic denial rather well, and if you wanted to have another shot at a secondary, you could potentially be doing psychic actions like mental interrogation with them, which isn't too bad for an entry cost of 55 points. It does mean that you wouldn't be able to take things like Abhor the Witch though if you happen to be playing Grey Knights. Finally, I thought we'd just round up with one strong list idea for Admech at the moment. I will admit that in tournament results there just aren't a lot of people playing Admech right now, and even fewer having any significant success. One recent one which I found on Best Coast Pairings was this one by Jason McKenzie, who appears to have used it to top a small tournament called GMI Games May. I think it does a pretty reasonable job of showing off some of the stronger things that Admech have to offer. The list is made up of a single Mars battalion using the Skitarii veteran cohorts. It's rather infantry heavy and led by 4 characters. There's 2 Skitarii marshals which will provide some rerolls and cancel some Doctrina negatives. One of them has the cohort relic and warlord trait, the Thrallnet, and calculate without diversion to do some stratagems, and the other one takes the great buff of the Exemplar's Eternity and also 5-point telemetry cache for cover on a unit. There's then a Manipulus with a Magnarail lance. He's Logi for ignoring that AP and has the raiment of the Technomartyr, 5+ Feel No Pain and fall back and shoot, and he'd be good to buff either the Rangers or the Vanguard with range and AP. Finally, there's a Techno-Archaeologist who can fit in the detachment due to the Brotherhood of the Cog rule. He can do objective things, but also takes Magi as well. That's the one for a bit of extra advancing, or he could go into the advanced parts to give another powerful shooting buff to one of the Rangers or Vanguard units. Squads-wise, there's 3 units of troops, 1 big unit of Veteran Rangers, and 1 big unit of Veteran Vanguard. I think that the Veteran Rangers are 15 in size to make the Wrath of Mars stratagem a bit cheaper, as it means that you'd be able to spam out a bunch of mortal wounds for just 1 CP rather than 2. In any case, there's 15 of them. They take a Taser Goad and Omnispec for ignores cover. They also have the Battle Sphere uplink, the one that'll allow them to fire without penalty even if they're moving, and they could broadcast that to someone else like the Vanguard or the Cerberus Raiders. Speaking of which, the big block of Vanguard has 20 men in it. They've got the Data Teller to allow things to be broadcast to them, Omnispec ignores cover, a taser goad on the sergeant, and programmed retreats to allow fallback and shoot. They look like they're a solid midfield choice for holding down objectives and getting very tough with bulwark doctrine and maybe the light cover perhaps. They'll be quite annoying to shift in combat as well due to their rad saturation. In the troops there's also a small unit of veteran rangers as well, looks pretty ideal for sitting on a home field objective and doing actions. Then for the more fancy infantry we've got 3 units of Skitarians in the elite slot, 2 units of infiltrators, 1 5-man with swords and 1 10-man with taser goads, should give some decent bullying in the midfield at the start of the game, and then a big unit of 10 rust stalkers with the transonic blades. They could go spectacularly fast if you wanted to, stacking aggressor doctrine, magi, and advance and charge, giving them an average threat range of something like 24 inches or so, and that's even before command rerolls. Finally, for the big blocks of units, there's a really big unit of Cerberus Raiders, which is quite cool to see a big unit like this. They'll be able to pre-game move, and as they're such a big squad, it looks like they could be quite good damage dealers. If you did soup them up with extra damage dealing, then they could prove a significant menace to enemy characters, and will be spitting out quite a lot of mortal wounds just on average anyway with those sniper weapons. With such a big unit, you could also bully enemy light infantry in combat quite well as well. Finally, and to add a little bit more muscle, there's a bunch of chicken walkers. We've got 4 Sindonian dragoons, a hefty countercharge threat with all those taser lance attacks, and they're also pretty fast and tough with the -1 to hit, and then 3 Iron Striders with the Cognis las cannons, a solid anti-tank force that could loiter in the back of the board, hopefully getting line of sight on what they need to with their good movement and that stratagem, and they could hit very hard for a turn as well with things like the Protector Doctrina or the Benevolence of the Omnissiah. Overall, as Admech go at the moment, it looks like a very solid and well put together list. Lots of the strongest things on show in full force, and good to see someone having some success with Admech, even though they're struggling in general at the moment. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for our look into Admech in 40k at the moment. I certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below, particularly if you've had any success using alternate builds or interesting units that you don't see played quite as often. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.